I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, a home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we have a full docket today. We're going to kick it off with Josh. He's going to talk us through the story with Mark Zuckerberg admitting that Facebook suppressed the Hunter story, actually at the encouragement of the FBI. We're going to continue our coverage of the Mar-a-Lago raid Ben is going to be talking about the affidavit that was released, or I should say redacted affidavit that was released in part. And then I'm going to cover this student loan forgiveness gift that I mentioned last week. It didn't indeed come true. The Biden administration is going to be giving out massive loan forgiveness. And finally, Emily is going to be talking about this very interesting issue of basically prime age men who have completely dropped out of the workforce. They're not employed. They're not looking to be employed. They're not in education or any other kind of training, and how that has changed and how that's going to affect so much of our politics going forward and our country. So with that, let me toss it over to Josh for our first topic.
Okay, so our first topic today is kind of the intersection of the intelligence community and the intelligence community and the deep state, and of course our big tech oligarchs. And that's actually a perfect transition to flag for you, the listeners and the viewers, that our big tech following co-host Rachel Bovard will make her triumphant return soon. So thank you for bearing with her pregnancy and her absence, but she's doing well. And we're excited to welcome her back. So yeah, let's talk about Mark Zuckerberg and the FBI. So this story is relevant, I think, for both those reasons that I already flagged. It's relevant for intelligence community, FBI, rot in the deep state purposes, and it is independently relevant for big tech, purportedly private adjuncts of the government perspective. So what happened, in case you've been asleep under a rock, is Mark Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan's highly popular podcast, and he effectively admitted that the FBI reached out to Facebook and warned about the Hunter Biden laptop story. It's unclear, I guess, exactly how specifically they flagged the exact fact pattern, but they basically said, be on the lookout for Russian misinformation, Russian disinformation. And of course, as soon as this story hit the New York Post, all the general, all of kind of the Clapper, Brennan, all the kind of the Obama, Biden aligned deep state types immediately kind of sprung into action and said, this is Russian propaganda. And we know what happened from there. Twitter obviously censored the Hunter Biden laptop story from even as so far as privately messaging it. You cannot DM it in your Twitter DMs. Facebook did not go quite that far, but what Mark Zuckerberg did admit to Joe Rogan is that the algorithms effectively severely depressed the story, so it would not show up really highly in anyone's news feed, thus confirming really, I think, what a lot of us had independently concluded. And there are all sorts of questions that are raised here. This, of course, happening just a handful of weeks after the unprecedented Mar-a-Lago pre-dawn raid from the FBI. The FBI has been in the crosshairs, I think, of a lot of folks on the right for many, many reasons, many of which is Ben has talked about, pertaining to the Russian collusion delusion, and going back, obviously, to Carter Page and Kevin Kleinsmith. And, all of us kind of know this tale by now. So really, I'm going to let Ben, I think, focus on kind of the FBI aspect of this. The big tech aspect of this is the piece that I'm a little more kind of personally interested in. So from my perspective, this is just another glaring obvious data point that our purportedly private big tech platforms are truly private in name only. They're Pinos, if you want to call it kind of like an analog of rhinos. They're private platforms in name only. These are basically state adjuncts at this point. Vivek Ramaswamy and Jed Rubenfeld, the Yale Law School professor, really kind of hammering home this theme for the past couple of years. They had a Wall Street Journal op-ed maybe in a week and a half, 2 weeks ago or so, that it was a successor to their outstanding January 2021 op-ed, basically saying treat these companies as state actors, because they really time and time again do show themselves to be willfully malleable to the puppet strings mastery of the government. And whether it was Jen Psaki at the White House podium last summer, basically saying that, of course, we're going to tamp down COVID misinformation. And this most recent op-ed from Ramaswamy and Rubenfeld kind of goes case by case and shows how they basically coordinated on the nuking of Alex Berenson from Twitter. That was the Biden administration's doing all along there. So the Zuckerberg-Biden story is just a massive, massive, massive confession of the extent to which the federal government and the Democratic Party in particular, when it controls the levers of power, treats these purportedly private platforms as just being state adjuncts. Now, from a public policy perspective, all that should do, I think, is augment and accentuate many of the various policy cries that some of us in kind of the big tech skeptical right have been pushing for years now. I mean, Facebook in particular, if it is truly going to be this supine to a federal government, should be treated as a common carrier. I think Facebook is a perfect candidate to be regulated the same way that a phone company is regulated as a common carrier. Various other companies, perhaps maybe like antitrust, or excuse me, like Amazon, should be just kind of broken up in good old antitrust fashion here. But from a big tech perspective, I think this story is a really, really, really big deal. The final thing I'll say, and then I'll just kick it over to you guys, it really kind of, from my perspective, I feel pretty confident in saying that big tech probably put this election in Biden's column, honestly. I mean, if you look at the 40 to 50,000 votes by which Biden won, like across Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia, Pennsylvania, honestly, the percentage of people who said that their vote would have gone the other way had they heard the Hunter Biden story, I think it's hard to say that big tech did not steal this election, to be honest with you. And I feel very confident in that now. But I'll toss it open to you guys for your thoughts on this.
Well, I'll be brief and take on the kind of FBI angle of this. On the one hand, this is a shocking story because essentially you have, well, this would be shocking in any other period in American history, because you have the security state saying jump and then big tech essentially saying how high. And while, Zuckerberg claims that there wasn't a specific directive over the Hunter Biden story, obviously there's an implicit assumption that if something like that arises, and then you have all of these deep state officials from past administrations saying this has all the classic hallmarks of Russian disinformation campaign. If you take Zuckerberg's words at face value, and I'm not sure if we should or not, given that it would seem that he's probably perjured himself in front of Congress before, at minimum, you have implicit First Amendment violation here, which shouldn't be at all surprising because, of course, you had government officials when it came to the coronavirus saying you need to police your platforms. The president saying, I think like Facebook and other networks are literally getting people killed, et cetera. So this would be just one more data point in what has become our brave new world. In any other period in American history would be stunning and staggering. But I think it also shows us just another leg of what I dubbed at Newsweek for Josh, the ultimate American information operation in terms of the Hunter Biden story. So you have all of these security state officials, former security state officials on the outside saying this is all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Then we've now found that within the FBI, they characterized the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation. Consequently, all throughout 2020, it seems, based on the whistleblower accounts, that there was essentially a standing order not to probe that laptop because it might be Russian disinformation. Then another leg of this effort was that you had FBI officials holding what was characterized or cast as a defensive briefing to the likes of Senators Chuck Grassley, I believe Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson, certainly Ron Johnson at a minimum, basically saying that they might be the victims of a Russian disinformation campaign around Hunter Biden and the Biden family's dubious dealings while they were investigating those very dubious dealings, which was all intended to throw cold water on their investigation because that defensive briefing leaked out to the press. So anyone who dared to investigate this was cast as either a dupe or a useful idiot of Vladimir Putin's regime, or worse, which of course the starting point for that narrative was Russiagate. And then you had, on the other hand, the protection of the Biden family by our security state in a whole variety of ways, including the information operation around the letter from these 50 plus officials, which was then parroted by the media, used by Twitter to justify its censorship, and then FBI going to Facebook prior to the election and censoring. And from Facebook's perspective, they would probably make the argument this absolves us of any sin because we were just listening and taking advice from our trusted federal authorities here. So it absolves themselves. And then also Zuckerberg made the claim that we still did a better job than Twitter in this. The last point I'll make is looking forward to the midterms and then 2024 and beyond. This is something that Zuckerberg can point to when the government again goes to him and other social media companies to be on the lookout for certain information to help try and swing an election, whichever way is preferred by the regime.
Emily, do you want to, I guess I'll just jump in. This seems to be the shape of so many of our problems, this kind of public-private partnership model. In this case, I actually think not only does it make the case stronger for example, what Josh said to treat some of these companies as common carriers, it also actually allows our legal system as is to deal with some of this through the courts more effectively, right? When you have this, it's much harder. The harder part of this problem from the policy perspective is how to deal with essentially collusion between entirely independent private actors versus the government actually like sending an email from somebody in the FBI that says suppress this story or suppress information of this type, right? Which is, and folks may or may not remember, about maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, I brought up this case in my final thoughts that the NCLA, Philip Hamburger's outfit, is actually pursuing with regard to COVID. Josh mentioned, that as well. It seems like the government has kind of gotten sloppy, right? I actually think this is kind of a good thing for our side. If they're sloppy enough to send these emails, because we know that the kind of cultural collusion and this kind of coordination is actually, you don't need to send an email because of the structure of what is increasingly this managerial class who have very, very similar opinions, political opinions across between the agencies and the Fortune 500 and the tech companies, right? That's much more difficult under our legal system to deal with. But if somebody's sloppy enough to send an email, we should absolutely be all over that, because essentially the government cannot pretend that the First Amendment doesn't exist by contracting around it. And that's kind of the structure of what has happened here. So I actually think this is somewhat good for us in the sense that it allows a hook in even for the traditional structures of our legal system. Of course, it leaves open the questions that Josh raises about what to do when those hooks don't exist, but where they do, we should absolutely be grabbing onto them in the current legal system.
All I'll say quickly, since we're about out of time, is just that there's a stunning level of coordination that the Zuckerberg conversation with Rogan highlights. I mean, this is across the board in an almost authoritarian sense. And what's really sad is that nobody forced it, right? Like, it's not authoritarian in the sense that there was anything being compelled. It was just the groupthink of our political elites was so strong that you had the media, the most powerful social platforms for discourse, and the government basically working hand in hand. We saw it with COVID. This is another example. The Biden campaign. We've seen it. The intelligence community, the Biden campaign, the media, and social media were all working hand in hand here, and nobody had to force it in a sort of typically authoritarian sense. So that's probably one of the most depressing things to consider.
And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ben to continue our coverage of this, what is likely going to be another, Russiagate style long story that we won't know everything about for many weeks to come, but to continue the coverage of the raid at Mar-a-Lago and the affidavit that was released.
Yeah, from one depressing topic to another. Although I will say in this one, to add a little bit of levity, maybe the most entertaining part in this kind of post-Republican world that we're living in is the fact that this affidavit, the affidavit heard around the world, which the government claimed, I guess rightly, that that they would redact it such that it would prove almost meaningless. That they actually, in addition to heavily redacting the affidavit, I believe 11 pages were fully redacted. This is the affidavit, of course, that was supposed to provide the justification for the search warrant, the raid that authorized the raid of Mar-a-Lago. In addition, the document which lays out why there ought to be and where there ought to be redactions in the affidavit itself was heavily redacted. So redacted document, and then you not only couldn't see why they undertook this unprecedented shock and awe raid, you couldn't look at their reasons for justifying why you can't see what happened in that unprecedented shock and awe raid. And I think that perfectly represents a security state that we know, going back to Russiagate, to invoke that point. Oftentimes he played games by over-redacting documents to the nth degree, claiming national security secrets, sources and methods, et cetera, of course, to stop us likely from seeing their malfeasance. And I only say that because we've seen this pattern play out time and time again on these documents. So on the merits of what was in the affidavit, maybe the most revealing part of the affidavit, beyond the fact that the government did not make at all an overwhelming case for why it would engage in such an unprecedented raid, which speaks to the political weaponization that this whole operation smacks of. As Kevin Brock said, a former senior FBI official, wrote in a piece at The Hill, they would have led this unredacted document, the unredacted portions, with the beef, if they had the beef in the document. The only other, I think, interesting part of it was the disclosure of the letter from Trump's attorneys, which basically shows the Trump team trying to cooperate with authorities, but also pointing out deficiencies with a potential case that was barely laid out in the unredacted portions of it. And on those merits, and I hesitate to go into the merits because, as we've established before, I think it's self-evident that this was a fishing expedition, but Margot Cleveland at the Federalist did an excellent job, I think, breaking down how laughable the so-called novel arguments raised here by the DOJ were to justify this whole operation. So she writes in part, and I'll quote a little bit from her article. First, the Presidential Records Act, which is one of the justifications for this raid, is not a criminal statute, and violations of that federal law do not constitute a crime. Second, Presidential Records Act does not reach broad swaths of documents retained by a former president, including quote unquote official records of an agency, personal records, and convenience copies of presidential records. And third, courts have refused to question a former president's conclusion that a record constitutes a personal record and not a presidential record. Then she goes into the espionage part of this, and she writes, the DOJ bent the Espionage Act to fit the facts of Trump's possession of documents at Mar-a-Lago. The Biden administration couldn't target Trump for mishandling classified material, both because he declassified it and because the statute that criminalizes such mishandling doesn't reach a president or a former president. So instead, they tried to find a crime to get the man. And of course, they threw obstruction charges as the cherry on top over God knows what. But I do think this document puts to bed the idea that this was really about nuclear secrets, even though the administration has been quick to report that the ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence, is out there reviewing damage assessment associated with these documents. There are some in Trump world who have speculated that this was about essentially the deep state recovering incriminating documents associated with Russiagate. That certainly seems plausible in connection with this operation, although I would have to assume they probably know what Trump would have had in his possession and that there'd probably be more copies of those documents, one would think. But the only other thing that is worth noting, and Tucker Carlson rightly picked up on this in a show the night before we recorded this, is that Kash Patel's name was not redacted in that document. So the DOJ, which claims to want to protect its own, does not want to protect someone who held a variety of senior positions in the Trump administration. I would argue because he was most responsible outside the administration, along with Devin Nunes, who he served on the House Intelligence Committee, for exposing the corruption that was Russiagate. And Patel has claimed that he was essentially there and can corroborate the fact that the president had a standing order about declassification, that he ordered for the declassification of all of these documents associated with Russiagate/Spygate, which of course others in his administration subverted, sat on, did not ultimately release to the public in the waning hours of his presidency. And Patel claims that he has been subjected to death threats and bigotry as a consequence of his name being included in that document. I believe him more than the FBI and DOJ, claiming that it's under assault from a MAGA army out there. And I think it's chilling and quite disturbing, but pointed and notable that his name was one of the few things of note, material that was left unredacted in that document. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to the group to talk about any of the specifics, either on the merits or the broader 30,000-foot view of what's been transpiring here in this Florida court.
Well, on the 30,000-foot view question, it continues to be more and more obvious that this is a fishing expedition. And we can tell that because it feels once again like we are in the early days of the Russia collusion hoax. Some of the exact same reporters are involved. We were talking about this actually on Inez's IWF podcast just yesterday that we taped. It's called High Noon, and folks should tune into that as well. But it's increasingly clear by the leaking that there's no there there. The innuendo about nuclear secrets, the innuendo about human sources, the innuendo about all of that, it to me is a very clear, glaring sign that we are dealing with another attempt to sort of do intelligence community gymnastics that would damn Donald Trump for things that may indeed be substantively problematic, but break hundreds of years of precedent and raid a former president's home problematic? Likely not. And again, we see this over and over again. It's the same thing with Russia collusion. It's the same thing with the phone call Trump had with Zelensky. Every time that something gets close, they really think it gets close to breaking a big norm, whatever it is. They think they can hold this up as the one thing. It's been happening since the Republican primaries in 2015, since Donald Trump said what he said about John McCain, since he said what he said in his announcement speech about people immigrating migrants at the southern border. Everything. This is the one thing that is going to end Donald Trump. We hear that over and over again. There was a lull after the impeachment trials and the investigations, and now it's just in the Russian investigation, and we're seeing it play out again, and the media is just as complicit once more.
So I really enjoyed our buddy Raheem Kassam's Substack post, which admittedly was speculating, but Ben kind of hinted at this when he said that some on the right were talking about the possibility that this was really about recovering Russiagate related documents. I would encourage listeners to go ahead and check out Raheem's Substack, which I thought made a decently compelling, at least, argument that this was ultimately about Russiagate. I just want to highlight two very brief kind of first principles level points. The first is, just to reiterate here, Donald Trump was the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief of the military has plenary across-the-board power to declassify whatever the hell he wants to declassify. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed this over and over again, including a late 1980s case called Department of Navy versus Egan. He frankly does not have to follow whatever statutory or regulatory authority purports to bind other executive branch officials because he has inherent Article 2 constitutional authority. He literally could have just scribbled down something on a piece of paper or informally said it. It doesn't matter. The other thing just to remember here is that whatever they recovered here, they waited over a year and a half. I mean, they literally waited over a year and a half. This was always the lie about the so-called nuclear secrets thing, which was clearly leaked to the Washington Post as a CYA cover your rear end style exercise from the FBI. It never made sense in the first place here. So bear that in mind too, as you process this information, whatever you're reading in the affidavit, they waited a year and a half. So one of two things is true. On the one hand, it's really not that important, the documents that were seized, which militates obviously in favor of the fact that this raid was completely unnecessary. Or on the other hand, or possibly both things, the government is just that incompetent that they did not realize that these documents were just simply aloof and missing for a year and a half. So just bear those higher level points in mind as well as you continue to process this unfolding story.
Yeah, I think I agree with almost everything that Josh said about, I think we're really seeing the working out of some of these constitutional erosion of the very important constitutional norms over time. And this, the sort of stuff that Nancy Pelosi was saying, are you serious? Are you serious? Right back in the Tea Party days. But we're seeing the real, like, rubber meets the road consequences of it. So one of those things would be, of course, the expansion of the administrative state, but related to that is the loss of the power the president has over his own executive branch, to the point where we're talking about a former president, is like that it could possibly be a crime that the former president declassified some documents not according to procedure or not according to congressional statute. Like this shows how much the erosion of the idea of the unitary executive, of the president's legitimate power over the executive branch actually is. And the second short point I'll make is this is once again a reminder of the danger of confusing the criminal domestic system with intelligence procedures, right? If we're talking about state secrets or whatever that Donald Trump has in a box in Mar-a-Lago, leaving aside the classification and legitimacy that runs through the president and that power that runs through the president, right? It's an encouragement to use the domestic legal enforcement in order to reach an intelligence goal, right? If you're collecting intelligence, you can break all kinds of procedures, but that's not supposed to be used for prosecution, right? And so now we have a total conflation starting with Russiagate, and basically in all of these episodes going forward, a conflation between the systems that are meant to essentially deal with information gathering abroad to protect America from international threat, and applying them in a domestic political context at home. So I think this is just another episode of that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and transfer to student loans. There's obviously a big bailout this week. The Biden administration releasing a plan has several elements. One, $10,000 of loan forgiveness to everybody up to an income of $125,000 per person. That means $250,000, $250,000, $250,000 per couple are eligible for this $10,000 bailout. If you received Pell Grants, which are legitimately only given out to very low income individuals, then you have potentially $20,000 in forgiveness that the Biden administration is making you eligible for here. There's some other important changes that have been flying under the radar. He extended the payment freeze for COVID through the end of the year after the midterms, obviously political. And then finally, something that's getting absolutely no coverage for those who are on income-based repayment plans, it actually halves the percentage that you're expected to pay of your income towards your student loan. So it goes from 10 to 5%, which is actually may end up being in many ways more fiscally disastrous over time than the immediate bailout. So just a few points on this. This is obviously, as I said last week, this is a absolute reverse Robin Hood situation. You are primarily taking from the working class and middle class of America and delivering benefits to the upper middle class. And in our kind of conversations, really what we're doing is to the managerial activist class are the primary beneficiaries of this. And the Biden administration has tried to hide this, in my view, very cleverly using statistics. So for example, you'll see a lot of charts and stats that have been passed around. I've seen it already repeated in all the major news outlets, in Axios, in WAPO, and everywhere, is using this breakdown of statistics that the Biden administration has put out, which very conveniently breaks the income of the recipients into less than $75,000, and then a couple categories after that up to $125,000. Well, that's above the median income in the United States. Right. So the bulk of borrowers, especially because they skew young, the vast majority of borrowers are going to fall under that under 75,000 statistic. So it's a way of playing with the numbers to try to disguise what's really happening here, which is, the truck driver from Ohio is paying for the students that Lawrence Tribe felt so sorry for. Lawrence Tribe over at Harvard Law has said, "Oh, this is going to help my students so much. Thank you, Joe Biden." So we're literally taking money from the truck drivers and giving it to students of Harvard Law. And fundamentally, that's what all student loan bailouts look like, because the underlying problem is that the working and middle class aren't going to university in nearly as large numbers and in proportions as actually they did before we started this student loan mess. I guess the final point would be, this is obviously disconnected from the real problem, which is the cost of college. The universities have benefited enormously from the blank check and the major subsidies that not just Democrats, but stupid Republicans have continued to extend to their political enemies, right? Their domestic political enemies. They continue to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars in subsidies and now in backhand and bailouts, right? But Republicans have agreed to the subsidy part in every budget going back decades to essentially make it easier to do a wealth transfer to woke universities and to make it easier and in fact more necessary for more and more Americans to go into debt to get essentially an ideological credential. That is the system, the underlying system here. And I think it's an appalling result of, frankly, Republican cowardice for the last 20 years we always have this argument here about like, what is it, punishing your enemies, rewarding your friends. Everyone should be able to agree, no matter sort of where your ideological background on the fights on the right are, that we should not be spending billions and in fact trillions of public dollars to essentially prop up the epicenters of the woke ideology and of the leftist ideology, and support them in their mission to continue to train up the elite of America and send them into the institutions where they cause the cultural revolutions in those institutions, like the FBI, right, that we've been talking about. We're literally paying for our own destruction, and it is just once again, just like a real condemnation or a real eye-opening moment if you look back at how Republicans have been willing to go along with this system that necessarily essentially kills off everything that they claim to stand for. So with that, I'll toss it back out to you guys on this student loan issue.
So the reverse Robin Hood is the right way to formulate this. That's definitely kind of the way that I've phrased it over the past week and a half as well. Just one other point to make, though, because Inez kind of got at this when she referred to the, rewarding friends, punishing enemies paradigm of possible governance. That really is what this policy actually is, right? This is the Democratic Party making a value judgment that the higher education cartel, and it is a cartel, and the DEI bureaucracies on campus and everything that kind of the intellectual rot, the degradation, the decadence that higher education America currently consists of. This is the Democratic Party making a value judgment to prioritize boostering that cartel, allowing them to have the moral hazard of spiking tuitions without any kind of repercussions at the expense of those who took out other loans, like auto loans or a mortgage or literally any other kind of loan here. There was never any kind of explanation whatsoever. There was never any attempt from anyone that I'm aware of, Green, Jean-Pierre, anyone, to attempt to explain why it is that the American taxpayer should be on the hook for hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of cross-subsidizing, bailing out their fellow students for taking out these egregious student loans to major in like lesbian dance theory or whatever, at the expense of kind of, the proverbial or literal, as the case may be, electrician or plumber who just took out like a basic auto loan. The whole thing just stinks rot to bottom. But the point that I made in my column that I wrote on this topic last week was I really do hope that to some extent Republicans take away a lesson here, that it is okay to engage in some level of tit for tat reciprocal politics where you do actually make value judgments, where you basically say that neutrality is a lie, that liberal neutrality is an illusion and a lie, and you actually get your hands dirty and you enact some policies that actually robustly favor your constituents and your voting base. Because the Democrats have shown time and time again they are not afraid of doing that. They are actually quite competent at that. It's kind of scary, it's kind of terrifying, but they're quite competent at rewarding their voters, their constituencies, their donors. Republicans, I'm not sure, to put it mildly, are capable of doing the same thing. On the contrary, to the extent Republicans try to kind of reward their constituents, it looks a whole lot like the 2017 tax cut, which is basically just like a warmed over 1980 style supply side tax cut that frankly just kind of liberates a lot of corporations that are in hock to various forms of woke ideology. So I hope the Republicans learn the right lessons from this.
I don't think Democrats have any idea what they've unleashed. I think this is going to be a scar on the Democratic Party for a generation at least. That's not to say Democrats have just lost all electoral success and sacrificed it on the altar of student loan forgiveness. But I do think what I've seen has been, if there are polls that show, let's say 35%, 45% support for what Biden did, what that can't measure very well and what it can't quantify is how intense the opposition is. So maybe 45% of the country supports it, but let's say 45% of the country opposes it, or 30% of the country opposes it, whatever the number is. That opposition is intense. There are people I've never seen be as animated about any issue in politics as they have been about the loan forgiveness. Republicans are going to spend money all summer tying every Democrat to this. There's evidence it's already working for Republicans in Georgia in the Herschel Walker race. And Democrats are going to have to answer for what just happened with this for years to come, and that will not go away because it is so intensely personal and so major. It has been a major turning point in so many people's lives. They built their lives around the decision to go into debt or to do something else to avoid not going into debt. So it's just deeply, deeply personal for a big chunk of people. And as Democrats are making their transition to being less of a party of the working class and more of a party of the suburbs, this is going to be a pivotal moment.
It's funny in a perverse way that with the afterthought of all this is sort of the $1 trillion price tag that we're all fronting, even though they originally said $300 billion. And of course, the moral hazard associated with this, which is, again, like an afterthought, but the fact that this is going to, of course, incentivize people to take out more debt going forward, encourage the schools to raise their tuitions to even more otherworldly levels that are totally unjustifiable. I think it's clear that this is an attempted vote buying scheme here. It is the regime rewarding its own, as has been laid out in brilliant analyses by all three of you. At the end of the day, this is about subsidizing the regime's foot soldiers and indoctrinators of future foot soldiers, plus in an indirect way, their schools, the institutions themselves as well. So it's rotten to its core. We also didn't even get to the notion of the constitutionality of all this, which is probably laughable that we're concerned about it and no one in Washington, D.C. is. Of course, we've all seen the clips of Nancy Pelosi saying this is something a president couldn't do, but all of a sudden now it can be done. And I think it's worth noting that contrast here. Donald Trump can't take documents back to Mar-a-Lago that were boxed and shipped out 2 days before he left the office. So that is while he was still president. But Joe Biden can wave his hand and forgive student loan debt. And last but not least, let's not forget here that the entire reason, or one of the primary drivers of the spiraling costs in education, beyond the fact that it's been that there have been thousands upon thousands of administrators hired at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year per, in many cases, which probably shouldn't exist in the first place. But that was all enabled precisely because of the government inflating the education bubble, the higher education bubble, certainly in the first place. So the government creates a problem, it waves a wand and seeks to forgive it. And all of the private risk ends up being transferred to the public, to those who ought not to be bearing it. It's clearly rubbing our noses in it, and particularly those who don't have an education, and good for them, by the way, for not going into these indoctrination factories, quite frankly.
Yeah, we're going to transition, but just to put a bow on that, there are no banks in this scenario. And I think that's one of the most consistent kind of misinformation facts that's out there. And this is my turn to call this misinformation. The number of people who answer me, well, the banks can take care of it. There are no banks. 93% of these loans are held directly by the taxpayer through the Department of Education. You are the bank. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Emily for our last segment on this very disturbing trend of a larger and larger section of the male workforce that just isn't in the workforce.
Yeah, and to make up some time, I'll just be fairly brief and say Nicholas Everstadt is out on Labor Day, so September 5th, with a new edition of his 2016 book, which was called Men Without Work. He wrote a new introduction that's crunching the numbers, after the pandemic. So now that it's the fall of 2022, what does this phenomenon look like? I mean, it's a hugely important trend. You have men getting by in various ways while sitting on the sidelines, mostly of the workforce. And here's a quote from the new book. As of this writing, more than 11 million job openings are unfilled. For every unemployed person, 2 positions stand vacant. Job openings so exceed the ranks of America's unworking prime age men that every member of this idle army could be placed in a job, and there would still be more than 3.9 million jobs awaiting candidates. What we know based on Everstadt's crunching of Bureau of Labor Statistics is Bureau of Labor Statistic numbers is that the way most of these men are filling their time screens on screens on screens on screens. So this has been going on for a long time. This is a trend from 2016 and 2016 on. In the 2016 book, Men Without Work, now Eberstadt says it could be called Work Without Men. There's something that's keeping men from working. The stimulus checks, obviously, if you parcel those out and live with a parent or something like that, you can kind of coast and do whatever you want basically and play Xbox or whatever it is. I think it's clear that these men need sympathy because there's a lot of pain. Over half, I think, are using opioids, maybe around a third. I'll check the number in the book for the final thoughts. But there's a lot of pain. Elites deindustrialize a huge swath of the country with no backup plan and no real way to catch people who were falling through the cracks of our society. And we are now left after the pandemic with a worsening problem that is affecting every single cultural problem we talk about. It's absolutely part of the student loan conversation. Underemployment is really high. So if you guys want to jump in, I think this is one of those things that is not part of our daily political discourse, but really should be.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the deindustrialization because, and I highly recommend Emily's interview actually with Eberstadt and on the Federalist podcast, which I listened to earlier today. So this actually, to some extent, throws a wrench into what might be called the Trumpian narrative of deindustrialization and elites selling out, which all of that can be true, right? But there's this parallel problem of people who are totally disconnected from civil society. So that's what this data shows and this book shows, is that a lot of these men, they're mostly not married. They don't go to a house of worship. They're spending the equivalent of a full-time job on screens and entertainment every week. And as Emily said, I think that there's a way to talk about this that is, I think they are quite figures of sort of atomization and sympathy. But that being said, the whole story is not that there aren't the jobs available. I think Eberstadt goes out of his way to show there are jobs available, and in fact, even men who have lower educational attainment, so men who, for example, have a high school diploma or even dropped out of a high school diploma and never got their diploma, dropped out of high school rather, they have wildly different rates depending on, for example, whether or not they're married or where they were born. So immigrants don't seem to have this kind of like structural issue finding a job. So that suggests that the jobs exist, but there is this consistent core of men. And the other thing that I think was really interesting about what Eberstadt has written is that this really started in the 1960s. Like the existence of a actually moderately large chunk of society of men between the age of like prime working age, who are not working, not in getting an education, furthering their education, and not in any kind of job training. That like being a large and persistent part of society really started in the 1960s and not before. So I think this is actually something that should make all of us think a little harder about the picture that we've been really building since 2015 and 2016 of what's happened to Americans, the American working class, because alongside it, there is this kind of non-working class part of America that has its own issues and is going to require its own solutions.
Yeah, so I definitely would encourage everyone to check out this study from Eberstadt. I mean, I guess here's what I have to add to this. I certainly agree with everything that Inez just said. I think it was actually quite well said. So I did a panel at the Florida Young Republicans, Miami Young Republicans annual conference here in Miami this past weekend. I did the panel with my good friend Dave Raboy. It was kind of funny. The title of this panel was what was it called? It was called like The New Right, what time is it in America? And I was actually wearing my T-shirt from Dave's Late Republic Nonsense Substack that just says what I know. The T-shirt says I know what time it is. Okay. Anyway, I kind of surprised myself. I was talking about like a lot of like so-called New Right, kind of NatCon, kind of Claremont Institute adjacent themes, but the one time that I found myself going on almost like an unhinged rant where I just really I was just talking so fast and so impassioned that I almost didn't realize what I was saying was when the moderator asked me about deindustrialization and like what it has done to the American heartland. And I guess I surprised myself. I didn't realize quite how fiery and how passionate I was about that. But I think in the middle of that kind of like verbal diarrhea that I let out there over the weekend, one thing that I said was that we should be able to pay slightly higher consumer prices on Amazon, supermarket, anywhere else for the sake of our fellow citizens, for the sake of giving good jobs for these men, whether they're working class, whether they're middle class, whatever. And it kind of just gets back to like the Orencast 2018 thesis of, the once and future work, or just the dignity of physical toil, of physical manufacturing. From like a very like traddy kind of traditionalist perspective, I mean, the white collarization, the technologicalization of your 9-to-5 job has probably had like really concrete negative impacts on men, because there's something to be said for physical labor, for getting into the manufacturing plant, for physical toil. I say that, of course, as someone who sits at his computer and reads and tweets and podcasts and all that stuff all day long. But there's something very much to be said for that. And, I'm happy that we're talking about it, because just the lack of I think, of physical toil manufacturing jobs is a problem in myriad ways. But simply for the sake of depression rates and all of that, it probably more so than anything else.
Well, also, since the 1960s were invoked, and Eberstadt has done certainly work on the Great Society as well. I mean, there has to be at least a correlative here, and maybe a causative, between the large expansion of the social welfare state and the fact that you could even have a percentage of society, several million people, prime working age males, who have dropped out of the workforce. Now, part of this is also, of course, that you've had a degradation of a culture which used to look with shame upon people who could work and would not work. And it's not to say that we shouldn't have empathy for those who, through no fault of their own, of course, have ended up out of a workforce, or have tried to get jobs and failed. But there were guardrails in place societally. There were cultural taboos that wouldn't be touched and such, that would have avoided the kind of situation that we face today, which I think is a tragic proxy for the direction that the West goes. I mean, it's kind of in two related points, or a related point that's interesting that haven't fully worked through in my own mind is, how do you explain that we in the West have grown so rich, so decadent, that we don't even have replacement level birth rates? Like, should it be that when a society grows rich, that it should be able to support more people, or that actually then those, particularly the elites, have declining birth rates, even such that they're not at replacement level? Same thing here. We've developed such riches and decadence that people can opt out of workforce altogether, be addicted to screens, infantilized, non-productive, and essentially be men in name only, from the perspective of, are you really an adult and a functional member of society if you aren't working a job, building a family, passing something on to others, so that your society is actually going to be able to perpetuate itself and better itself going forward? These are questions that do transcend public policy, even though public policy certainly significantly impacts them. But most of all, I think these are tragic trends, and a proxy, or some one point that you can look to when you think about the fact that the West is going in an unsustainably dark and disturbing direction.
And I think with that, we're going to go ahead and transfer to final thoughts, and I'll take the moderator's prerogative perhaps and go first. Just to put one more point on the student loan question. There's a dumb way to talk about this that really reminds me of that meme, Old Economy Steve. That was like a meme, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, but it had, sort of boomer age dad-like figure saying, well, why don't you just send in your application, son? That's how I got hired, right? So there's that aspect to this. I think a lot of Republicans talk about this, and people on the right talk about this in terms of personal responsibility of 18-year-olds. And it's not that I disagree that an 18-year-old is an adult, but I don't think that 18-year-olds are wildly more irresponsible today than they were 30 years ago. What's really changed here is the cost of university and the value of a degree that doesn't back that up. And that is a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution, not kind of blaming 18-year-olds for signing on the dotted line when all of society told them that was the responsible and right thing to do, was to go to the best school that will have you no matter how much it costs, because don't worry, you'll pay off your loans. It seems to me to be a bit much to sort of heap moral scorn on 18-year-olds when US Congress was so fiscally irresponsible by handing out these unsecured six-figure loans to every 17-year-old in America. I don't think that framing is accurate, and I think it really will hurt the right if we talk about it only in that way. And finally, one little point. One of the talking points of the administration, as well as, of course, filtered through the administration's mouthpieces in the media, has been that this is a problem that disproportionately affects women, right? That women are getting screwed by student loans because they hold more student loan debt. There's a truly amazing piece out in Axios from this, where they have several bullet points suggesting why it might be the case that women hold more student loan debt. They suggest it's because women make more on average than men. That's a myth in terms of making that for same work. That's a myth that's been blown up I don't know how many times at this point that persists. But they have a bunch of these bullet points about how women are more oppressed. Well, nowhere in those bullet points does it mention that, in fact, there are just fewer men going to college now. So it's truly remarkable how the feminist movement has taken essentially an advancement of women at the expense of men. There are more women now disproportionately going to college than men, and that increases in the higher degrees, right? They've taken that and turned it around into yet another oppression of women, right? Because of that, women hold more debt instead of student loan debt. Therefore, women are oppressed, right? So it's one of those utterly ridiculous sort of Rubik's Cube of a situation where there is no possible combination of how the world could be that would not lead to the conclusion that women are oppressed in this country. I just thought that was kind of funny and worth throwing out there.
My final thought sort of piggybacks on that. The statistic that I referenced earlier, I pulled it up from Eberstadt's book. It is about half of men who have dropped out of the workforce, aren't looking for work, are prime working age. About half of them report using some sort of pain medication every day. So that's the number I was referencing. It wasn't specifically opioids, but to Inez's point, I know we've talked about this a lot, and I reference it all the time, probably ad nauseum, because it was what I did in college. But when I was helping Christina Hoff Sommers on the re-release of War Against Boys in like 2012-ish, I, as a kid who grew up in the 90s and was in school in the 90s, looked at all of these trends that Christina had demonstrated in like 1999. And it terrified me to my core, because I realized there were going to be massive, massive, massive cultural implications of cutting down recess time, disciplining boys for rough and tumble play, feminizing the public school system, all of these different things where we made school much easier or much more accommodating to girls. And we made it easier for girls to learn. And we didn't adjust for how that would become or how those gains would come at the expense of men. So, women making gains, great. Doing it at the expense of men without any preparation, without any adjustments for that, is why you have this vast army of men who were paid not to work in stimulus checks. Maybe they dabble in the gig economy. I don't know. Maybe they live with their parents. I don't know. They get money from various places, whatever it is. We have a surplus of jobs, and we have men who are watching screens and taking pain medication. And that is an incredibly sorry state of affairs for the United States of America. And it's not a part of our national conversation at all, because the people who control the national conversation don't know anybody like that. They don't know the people who have checked out of civil society. They don't know the people who are taking pain medication every day and who would rather not work than work, because the alternative is some disgusting Amazon factory where you're treated like a robot. So all that is to say, it's sort of mind-boggling how little we talk about that.
So I guess I'll talk about an issue that has faded from the public consciousness over the past few weeks, but for a brief kind of period of time there, it was much talked about, and that's kind of semiconductors and industrial policy and the CHIPS Act. So on my own podcast, Newsweek, which I would very selfishly encourage you to listen to, of course, I had on Orncast this week, and we talked about this, among other topics in conversation. We spent a lot of time on student loans. We talked about the semiconductor debate as well. So the CHIPS Act ended up passing with not a ton of Republican support, but if you kind of read between the lines here, and I think Oren's right to point this out, if you look at what some of the critics were saying, some of the critics like Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation, like Jim Banks, the populist inclined Republican congressman from Indiana, their criticism was not so much on kind of Tea Party era kind of cronyism, winners and losers, kind of free market absolutism grounds. The criticism of the CHIPS Act was actually that it didn't go far enough, that it didn't go far enough actually in affirmatively preventing recipients of aid to actually then go ahead and invest that money in manufacturing, in semiconductor production, in foundries over in China, or really anywhere other than America for that matter there. And I guess I just want to underscore the point of how absurd it is that US policymakers have let themselves get to a position where something like 80 to 90% of the most advanced chips in the world are really made by one company, by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And moreover, that one company happens to be located in a city in Taipei and Taiwan that are, oh, by the way, like our arch geopolitical foe, the People's Republic of China, is thinking about invading basically every day. I mean, from like kind of like a black pill perspective, it's probably only a matter of a time. And it gets back to just this kind of a twilight era of the Cold War, kind of 1990s era mindset that was really encapsulated by this Bush 41 White House economist who basically said, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he said, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference, right? This is kind of just, this is kind of like a caricatured straw man version of Adam Smith and like Ricardo's kind of, theories on trade and comparative advantage and things like that. But, the point that Oren made on my podcast, and again, he's right about this, there is no intrinsic comparative advantage that Taiwan, or for that matter, South Korea and Samsung has when it comes to semiconductors. The fact that TSMC and Samsung have become way more prolific at making 3 nanometer chips or whatever than Intel or any other US company is a direct function of state support and kind of deliberate policy decisions to channel intellectual capital and human capital into these fields. And I think that, the sooner that Americans realize that, whether the CHIPS Act that passed happened to be perfect, it seems like it was not perfect. It was probably an improvement on the status quo ante. But the more that we start to realize that, the better, because it is just absurd that we are in a position here where our F-35s, our computers, smartphones, whatever, like all of our stuff is basically dependent on these small chips and, an island halfway around the world where our arch geopolitical foe is thinking of marching in every day. They produce the most advanced chips. So it's just truly an insane world. But I just wanted to get that off my chest, I guess.
Okay, I'll be brief. Speaking of insane worlds, to go back to my segment on kind of the Mar-a-Lago raid affidavit, but actually the 30,000 foot point. I think one thing that the affidavit does affirm, which is quite significant, is that essentially, and this to the points made by our other esteemed anchors here, mimics in a lot of ways the other Get Trump scandals out there. Essentially, this was an angry archivist or several angry archivists working hand in glove with the Biden White House plus DOJ/FBI in a fishing expedition Get Trump effort. The affidavit itself does not dispel that entire narrative. This comes 19 months after the documents were actually moved, just outside the 90-day, supposedly no political investigation period for the FBI and DOJ, even though they've broken that repeatedly in the past. And I think one way to look at this is, yes, there's a lawfare component of this, but there's also the information warfare component of being able to hide the truth behind the redactions, leak out that which is viewed as politically important, suck the oxygen out of the room and reportage as we go into a midterm election, and divert from the various disasters that our regime has inflicted upon us, even though this is a disaster in and of itself. And I think going forward, maybe we ought to think about what the broader ramifications of the raid are, both in 2022, 2024, and then to our Republican order, to the extent any of it exists going forward, because this is that substantial an effort, even though it is so laughable on its merits.
And with that, on behalf of Ben, Emily, Josh, thank you so much for tuning in to NatCon Squad. I'm Inez Stepman, and I've been filling in for Rachel Boulevard, who will be back next week. See you at the next NatCon Squad.